Okay, very good. Okay, we should get started. It's just after the hour. Welcome everyone to Global Friday. My name is Gary Wilson, and I'm a member of the Global Friday Organizing Committee. So I'll be getting things started today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that many of us here are based at UNBC in Prince George, and the Prince George campus is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Lheidli Nation. And we're very grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in these territories. And the region of Northern BC and the campuses of UNBC are also located on the traditional unceded territories of many nations across this region. So thankful for that. The session today is going to focus on climate justice, politics, and policy. And it's part of a larger international initiative called the Worldwide Climate Justice Teach-In, which is being organized at UNBC by the students in the Environmental Studies 480 Capstone course, which is taught by Drs. Annie Booth and Dr. Sinead Early. So I'm very happy that they've agreed to be a part of Global Friday, and I'm going to pass it over now to Kristy Aitchison, one of the students in the course, you can see on the screen there, and she's going to be the moderator for this panel. So I'll let her introduce the panelists and get us started. Over to you, Kristy.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. I'm really happy to be here this morning. Good morning to everyone who chose to join us at the Global Fridays. So as Gary mentioned, my name's Kristy Aitchison. I'm in the final year of the Environmental Sustainability Studies program, and I'm very proud to be a part of the ENVS 480 Senior Capstone course. I'd like to thank Dr. Annie Booth and Dr. Sinead Early for making this course and this event possible. And thank you to my fellow classmates for doing such amazing work towards a more sustainable future. And of course, thank you so much to our panelists for choosing to join us this morning. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So just a brief outline for this panel, which is being held in collaboration with the Global Fridays. We have approximately an hour and a half. So each guest speaker will have 10 to 15 minutes to speak from their personal perspectives for a total speaker time of 1 hour. Following, we'll have approximately 30 minutes to lead the discussion on the various aspects of our panel topics, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So what exactly is a climate and justice teach-in? As mentioned, the students of the Environmental Studies 480 Senior Capstone course have organized a 3-day climate and justice teach-in, which was being held from March 23rd to 25th. So we have one more later this afternoon. As part of the Bard College Worldwide Initiative, institutions around the world are hosting teach-ins at the end of March with the aim of engaging their campuses and communities in critical dialogue on climate solutions and justice. As we're all part of Canada's Green University, we feel that it's really important that our whole campus participates in these discussions and that we bring forward the work that our faculty, staff, students, and community members are all doing around these critical issues. So this is the second last panel we'll be hosting. As I mentioned, we have one more this afternoon, the Youth and Climate Action Panel, which is also happening on Zoom between 2 and 3. You can find the link for that on our website or social media. The prompt for this panel, as given to the panelists, was how can Canada achieve climate justice in the political sphere and on the international stage? How do other actors such as the UN, other nations, stakeholders, and rights holders come into play when Canada is developing its own climate and justice policy? So I'll begin by introducing the panelists first, and then we'll hear from each individually. So we have Dr. Daniel Sims, who is an associate professor in the First Nation Studies program. He was born and raised in Prince George and is a proud member of the Safaei Dene First Nation. His research focuses on Northern British Columbia, and he's worked extensively with not only his own community, but also the related communities of Quadacha and McLeod Lake. He's currently working on 2 books through the University of Alberta Press on the impacts of the WAC Bennett Dam and the Williston Lake Reservoir, and the impacts on all 3 of those communities. As if that wasn't enough, he's also working on a research project that's titled A Forgotten Land, Development in the Finlay Parsnip Watershed of Northern British Columbia, 1860 to 1956, that examines numerous proposed developments in the Finlay Parsnip watershed through the lens of concepts of wilderness development and colonialism. Dr. Michael Murphy is a professor in the political science program and an adjunct professor in the natural resource and environmental science program at UNBC. From 2006 to 2015, he held the Canada Research Chair in Comparative Indigenous State Relations. Michael's research and teaching interests include the politics of ethnocultural and ethno-national diversity, Indigenous state relations, democracy and democratization, and ethnics and public affairs. He's also currently developing a course on the politics of climate change. Dr. Jalil Safaei is a professor and chair in economics in the International Studies Graduate Program. Dr. Safaei's main research is on the social determinants of health, political economy of health and healthcare, social policy and welfare systems, health inequity, and human rights. His research interests spread to macroeconomics and the chronic issue of poverty and inequality. Aven Knutson is a natural resource and environmental studies graduate student. Her research focuses on Indigenous self-determination and a climate planning partnership. Aven's thesis aims to document the partnership approach to climate change planning undertaken by the government of the Yukon and its Indigenous partners in the design of our clean future. She aims to assess the suitability of the state Indigenous collaborative climate planning process in representing community voices and agency and policy development and outcome, and to develop recommendations to guide future climate planning partnerships between governments and northern communities. I really don't think we could have found better suited panelists for this discussion. It's almost like we planned it this way. And without further ado, who would like to begin our discussion today? Any volunteers?
Maybe I can start so that I don't have to follow all the professors here.
Great, thanks, Aven. Take it away.
Okay. So my name's Aven, and I'll just start maybe by giving an overview of, how climate justice factors into my master's thesis project. So I'm really looking more at how kind of different aspects of justice play into the development of climate policy in the Yukon rather than specific development of climate justice policy. But basically, I'm looking at a climate planning process that the government of Yukon recently undertook. So I think it was released in 2020. They put together a strategy for the next 10 years for climate change, energy, and a green economy. And I'm looking at this process because they took a novel approach to collaboration in this strategy, where they kind of had this collaborative approach where at one level they really focused on community engagement and actually doing community visits and getting those voices into the strategy in terms of what people wanted to see in an action plan for climate change in the next 10 years. And then they also had kind of stakeholders come in where they would do these meetings with stakeholders with maybe industry or special interest groups and stuff like that. But then at a second level, they had this decision-making table where they invited Indigenous nations and transboundary nations, along with Yukon municipalities, to actually come to the table to participate as partners in decision-making. So that kind of speaks more maybe to that aspect of involving rights holders or stakeholders in the process. And the approach that they took was really new to Yukon government in kind of trying to develop this shared decision-making process with Indigenous nations, particularly as partners rather than just stakeholders. So recognizing that kind of rights holder, view of these nations as partners in the process. So I would say in terms of justice, the major contribution of my project is that I'm examining this process through the lenses of procedural justice and Indigenous self-determination. So basically, I'm looking at how partners in the strategy felt that Indigenous nation voices and agency was expressed from the strategy development through to its outcomes, as well as how people felt that they did in representing community member voices and agency as well. And then I'm also looking at that self-determination piece, so how partners felt that the process was able to support both resurgence, so potentially of cultural practices in stuff like governance and decision-making, as well as through to reconciliation. And that was especially around looking at government-to-government relationships and establishing better trust for good relationships moving forward in collaboration. So in terms of the wider Canadian context of climate justice work, my work is pretty focused on the Yukon context, which has a rather unique history of modern land claims processes. So it's kind of a smaller piece of the national landscape, I guess, of climate policy. We have 12 out of 14 First Nations who have established self-government and final agreements with Yukon government and the federal government. So it's kind of just a unique legal situation, and trying to navigate these relatively modern land claims agreements and what that means for decision making and partnering with these nations is kind of rapidly changing in a lot of cases. But this is one approach in this project that was taken to kind of try and deal with the issue of climate change, which people recognize is a priority for Indigenous nations as well as for Yukon government, and coming together collaboratively to try and work on it in ways that further goals on both sides. So I would say that I'm still in the process of putting together a coherent picture of how my findings actually answer my research questions. But some of the preliminary themes that have emerged from interviews and document analysis include the nuances that people see between a collaborative approach versus a regular consultation. And that was everything, from the initial approach that people took to actually engaging with nations through to how decision-making happened. The importance of flexibility in a just planning process that allows for different and changing priorities, capacities, and resources. The importance of processes that account for local context in planning and selection of actions to implement. So that was really key because in a lot of cases, like in the Yukon, we have a central government making decisions for small communities, and they don't actually have a lot of that context to make decisions about what actions will be most applicable to those contexts. And so this process really tried to get more of that voice in there to figure out what are local needs and priorities and how can these actions meet them. And then finally, just the ways that different ways of knowing and different leadership styles influence how planning for climate change is conducted, the ways that knowledge is collected, communicated, and actually expressed in the strategy, and even just the priorities that are addressed for climate action. And then overarching all of those, one of the themes that really appeared in every single conversation that I've had in this research is the importance of relationship building to conduct meaningful and impactful work in this area that actually, contributes to establishing trust and better relationships that support continued collaboration. And everybody kind of mentioned, the tricky balance of trying to work in that area to actually balance all the competing priorities, worldviews, and timelines that everybody has from those different government sides. And that's like trying to create a plan that's just and allows time for relationship building, which can be really slow. But it also has to happen quickly enough that you're addressing the urgent nature of climate change as an issue that's already impacting these northern communities. So those are kind of important elements of climate justice, I'd say, that come into play in my examination of the development of climate policy in this kind of little regional piece of the wider Canadian landscape. But thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Aven. That is really important work you're doing through engaging and relationship building and trust building, building the path to reconciliation. I really appreciate that. Would like to follow Aven.
I don't mind following on unless someone else is really keen to go.
Go ahead, Dr. Murphy.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Kristy and the other organizers for putting on this event and also for the opportunity to speak. I'm very much a newcomer to this debate. My background, as my very brief bio mentioned, I have a lot of experience teaching in the areas of Indigenous state relations, questions of democracy and diversity, democracy and democratization. But yeah, not much in the area of climate politics. And I think it's fair to say that political scientists in general have been slow to take up these very important issues. And you still, from my initial research, again, I'd see there's a real slow uptake on this issue. And I think that's a real gap in the research and a real gap in the teaching. So as Kristy mentioned at the beginning, I'm currently developing a course on the politics of climate change. I'm hoping to offer this for the first time in 2023 in January. And that's, a small step I'm trying to take. partly as a means of educating myself on these issues, trying to draw together some of the questions on climate change together with my, with my more general experience on politics. And I do think there are some very interesting crossovers here, particularly with questions of Indigenous state relations and also democracy and democratization. But yeah, again, it's I know there's some other excellent courses being offered already at UNBC, particularly in environmental studies, international studies. And hopefully this new course in Paul's can help complement some of those other offerings. Okay, so hopefully, part of what I'm trying to do here is to somewhat lower your expectations as to what I'm going to be able to provide you today as a newcomer. The panel prompt, part of the panel prompt, the first part is how can Canada achieve climate justice in the political sphere and on the international stage? Now, one way to answer this question, and perhaps the most obvious way to answer this question, is to focus on what the Canadian national government can do, both domestically and also on the international stage. And of course, that would be a very important way to approach the question, given the tremendous resources, influence, and authority that national governments can bring to bear on the climate justice issue and many other issues. And of course, their actions or their inactions on this issue can have very, very important consequences, right? Very, very powerful consequences. However, that's not the approach I've chosen to take here today. I've chosen to take a slightly different approach. And that's to emphasize that the ability of the Canadian government, and indeed any other national government, to make real progress on climate justice in many ways depends on the actions and choices of many, many other actors. And this includes the actions and the choices of committed democratic citizens. So that's going to be my focus here today in my very brief remarks. And what I'm going to do is to briefly emphasize what I think are three relatively simple and straightforward ways in which citizens of Canada or any other democratic state can help advance the climate justice agenda. Okay, and I've organized these ways under three headings. The first is action, the second is persuasion, and the third is understanding. And there's some obvious interrelationships between the three. Okay, so starting off with action, I think there's a number of very easy things here that democratic citizens of Canada can do. And perhaps the easiest set of things they can do in the area of action is to make climate-friendly choices. Okay, so again, I think taking a step back before I go into much more detail, politics is partly about managing conflict, but politics is also very much about managing the terms of our collective life together, right? Managing the terms of cooperation, also conflict, in order that we can all, that we can live a common life and that we can all pursue our own ends, our own well-being. Okay, part of that again involves government activity, but part of that involves our own choices, our own actions, and our own inactions. Okay, so our personal choices, our personal actions or inactions are very much political. Okay, so what are some of the climate-friendly choices we can make? I think these are all going to be fairly obvious. Choices about transportation, whether or not to use the car as opposed to public transport. Our choices around travel, or perhaps choosing not to travel or traveling in a way that has less of a carbon footprint. Our choices regarding the foods we eat, eating less beef, for example, choices with respect to housing. Okay, so a lot of these basic, very day-to-day choices that we can make about what we buy, how much we buy, where we travel, how much we travel, can, when you add up the actions, the inactions of a whole bunch of citizens together, that can have some very significant impact on advancing the objective of climate justice. Okay, so that's the first thing I would emphasize under action. I think, again, that's probably the easiest thing that all of us can get involved with. The second relatively easy thing is to get involved in elections. Okay, get involved in elections at the federal, provincial, and also the municipal level. Okay, again, it's not easy to go out there and vote. It's a little bit harder to go out and read the party platforms, but again, I think that's also in a very important way. in terms of informing yourself and a voter and making informed choices, and making informed choices is going to help you better inform meaningful government action, is going to help you better hold governments accountable that are not engaged in meaningful climate action. Okay, so you know, you don't have to run for office, but certainly going out and voting. Okay, I think it's a very basic, you know, it's very basic to emphasize it in political science that governments, you know, particularly when we're talking democratic governments, tend to give citizens, not always, but they tend to give them what they want. Okay, and they tend to respond to the signals that citizens give them for things that are very unpopular. Okay, and one of the most effective ways of doing that is to go out and vote. If you don't vote, then you're pretty much ensuring that your voice is not going to be, or not ensuring, but there's other ways to get your voice out there. But obviously, participating in elections is one of the most obvious, and I think one of the most effective ways. Okay, now getting involved in federal and provincial elections is perhaps most obvious because, again, these governments wield a lot of authority and jurisdiction when it comes to climate change mitigation. But participation at the municipal level is also very important, okay, because municipal governments, first of all, control a lot of things, a lot of jurisdictional space that can have a very important impact on climate change mitigation. If you take a look at the city of Prince George's climate change mitigation plan, you'll get a sense of some of the things over which municipal governments have a lot of control, and to get a very clear sense that their actions or inactions can have a very significant impact on either leaving greenhouse gases output at current levels, or increasing them, or much better reducing them. Okay, I think at the municipal level, and this is also important at both federal and provincial levels, is there's some research that shows that having, you know, good climate leadership, right? Good climate leaders as part of your federal and provincial and municipal governments can be critical in terms of motivating action, meaningful action on climate change. Okay, so getting involved in elections at all these levels, I think is very important. Connected to that is the idea of getting behind electoral reform. I know this is we've had several go-rounds at this in British Columbia, both of them unsuccessful. They've also been unsuccessful in other places in Canada. You know, I think there are many reasons to get behind electoral reform, but there also is a fair bit of research now. And again, I haven't done a lot of this research, but I have looked into it a little bit. There is a fair bit of research that suggests that countries with proportional representation electoral systems are in fact doing better at climate change mitigation. Okay, so again, I'm always surprised at how little people get involved with these electoral reform initiatives. But again, if you're someone who's very committed to climate justice, getting behind electoral reform can be a very effective way of motivating, of producing, better and improved action from governments on that score. The last thing I'd like to mention under action, this is the slightly more challenging ask of citizens, is to get involved in a non-governmental organization. Okay, it's of course more challenging to get involved in an NGO directly, but you can also get involved by making a financial contribution. And again, these organizations exist at the local, provincial, national, and international level. And again, there's some evidence that they can have a very positive impact on climate justice. Okay, moving on now to persuasion. The reason I've included this in here is that, you know, a big part of the discussion around climate inaction in particular is the problem of, or the challenge of, climate change skeptics or deniers. Okay, so there are still a significant number of people, and not just in Canada, but also in other countries, other democracies, people who simply don't believe in the science behind climate change, don't believe climate change is an issue at all, or at least not a very big issue to deal with. So one of the key questions is, you know, how do we persuade these people? Now, it's, I think one of the most natural reactions is simply to dismiss these people as irrational people who are don't pay attention to the evidence, or perhaps might be conspiracy theorists. But really, that's not an effective approach, right? I think the key here is to try to understand why these people are skeptical, and to try to figure out how to persuade them rather than simply dismissing them. Okay, and again, this is not an area of research that I've done a lot of looking into, but I have done some looking into. And there are some important insights to be gained here, particularly from the field of psychology, but also from political science and some related fields that actually yield some interesting insights as to how to persuade climate change deniers, right? Okay, so some of the messages that I've gleaned from my very cursory skimming of this literature is, first of all, the importance of positive rather than negative messaging. Okay, so climate change skeptics and deniers seem to respond better to a message that links climate change mitigation to improving societal welfare. Okay, so talking about, how's this going to make a better society where people are more caring, where people are able to live better lives, as opposed to simply emphasizing the risks of inaction, which is more of a negative message. Okay, similarly, this research also seems to suggest that appealing to people's values, right, their value sets, whether they're religious values or other kinds of secular values, rather than simply hitting them with the facts on climate science. Okay, now the facts are not irrelevant, but the research suggests that appealing to values at the front end is a more effective way of persuading people. Similarly, tailoring the story you're telling about climate change to a particular audience. So again, I think looking to persuade, persuasion is very much linked with understanding, right? Let's not simply dismiss people. Let's not simply assume that we know the reasons why they're climate change skeptics or deniers. Let's try to find out, what really are the blockages here, and that will help us craft messages that might bring some of these people on board. And again, that's also important for some of the things I said in under action, right? Governments will have a difficult time getting behind really serious climate change mitigation initiatives if a significant portion of the electorate is not on board with those initiatives. Okay, that's the simple logic of electoral politics. The second thing I'd like to say here, and again, this is not anything I've looked into in much detail, but I've been struck a couple of times by things I've read in the media, which suggest that even amongst those people who accept the climate science, who accept that climate change is a reality, and who are very genuinely concerned about the impacts of climate change and about not doing anything about climate change, are still not really prepared to take meaningful action on climate change. Okay, so I looked at studies out of Germany and Canada on this, and both of them suggest that the amount of sort of financial sacrifice that amongst these people are willing to make is not very significant. Somewhere in the neighborhood, I think, of $100 I was reading, or 100 euros in the German study. So again, the question arises there, right? We tend to assume that people who are concerned about climate change will automatically be motivated to actually do something in their own lives about climate that has an effect on climate change mitigation. But what these studies seem to suggest is that that's not necessarily the case. Okay, so again, we need to figure out what the blockages are here. Why are not people translating their climate change concern into genuine climate change action? How can we motivate these people to make that connection? Okay, and again, that also goes back to, if governments are going to put down policies that require a bit of additional sacrifice, it's important to have citizens on board who support them in doing so, or even better, who push them to do so. The last thing I want to say, the third of my labels is understanding. I've already emphasized understanding in one sense, understanding is important to this action of persuading both climate change deniers, but also persuading climate change, people who are not climate change deniers, but who are not prepared to yet take the necessary actions, right, to put their money where their mouth is. Okay, so understanding is important there to motivating both of these constituencies. Understanding is also important, critically important, I think, in terms of our role in pushing governments for better climate change policies, and also our ability to hold them accountable for policies that fall short. So I'll emphasize two things here. First of all, it's absolutely essential, I think, that citizens understand and evaluate the different political platforms and the different policies that are on offer. Don't simply assume that either the Liberals or the Greens or the NDP have a better climate change policy. Go out and actually have a look at their platforms, look at their policies, and also look at the independent analyses of these policies, what they have to say. Okay, we should also, and again, I know this can be more challenging, take a serious look at their international negotiating positions. Okay, because again, if you don't have that information, then you might be voting for the wrong party, the wrong policy, you may be holding governments accountable for the wrong kinds of thing. This is connected to a second point, and this is the final point I'll make. And this is to understand the political pressures and constraints that national and subnational governments are contending with. Okay, both domestically and internationally. Okay, so these governments are not operating in a political vacuum. There's all kinds of pressures and constraints that they're working under when they're engaged in their own policy making, and in particular when they're engaged in negotiations at the international level. Why is this important? Again, I think it's important so that we can hold their feet to the fire in a way that is more realistic and potentially more effective. So in other words, we want to demand, a lot from our national governments and our subnational governments, but we don't want to demand the impossible from them. And with that, I will hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. You really touched on some resounding comments throughout the panels that I noticed about when you were talking about persuasion and keeping it positive over negative. We talked a lot about keeping the hope and not, having that doomsday mentality. And then also, meeting people on that level where they're at, not passing judgment, and just really trying to figure out how we can get everyone on board with moving forward. And of course, using our voice and our choice through, politics and purchasing power, all really important things. I would really like to see a little bit more government policy or international policy involving, corporations and industry, since they do, the majority of the polluting, but we'll talk about that later. Who would like to follow up? Dr. Sims?
Unmute myself and follow up. So I just want to say, Dana Chea, again, thank you for recognizing we're on the traditional territory of the Lheidli. A new movement in the territorial acknowledgement, particularly in those provinces that use hydro, is to also recognize which nations have been devastated by hydroelectric development. And hydroelectric development is an excellent example of some of the issues that we're facing when it comes to climate change. The Site C project is clean energy, is what we're told by the province, even though it will be devastating to the local environment. It'll flood, thousands of acres of land in the north to provide power for the rest of the province. And currently we get about 25% of our power from the WIC Bennett Dam, which was built in the 1950s, 60s, completed in 68, and destroyed my homeland. And quite literally, in some instances, the bones of my ancestors went through those turbines to provide power that we're using right now. So, this is the reality of the situation. And I guess my focus is trying to talk about what needs to happen, what can happen at an international level, but also local level, but also kind of looking at the Indigenous perspective as well. I don't mean to be a doomsayer, but I will say that my work is an interesting approach of combining kind of environmental history with legal history. And economic history. So kind of combining those three. And prior to being at UNBC, I regularly taught courses on environmental history of the world, of Canada, as well as economic history. So kind of looking at things from those multiple perspectives. I was also in the province of Alberta, and I think that's one of the big issues when we look at Canada and what Canada can do is that we have an entire province to the east of us that is built on oil and gas, with a lot of people who do not believe climate change exists at all and are quite vehement about it not existing and are quite anxious to extract as much oil, natural gas, other petroleum products, and make as much money as they possibly can. And I say that as somebody who lived there for many years, listened to political politicians, and as I was leaving, found out that they were going to reopen coal mines and build new ones in the Rockies, potentially getting rid of provincial parks to do so. So there is very much this focus on not really caring about the environment to the east of us, but we are in bed with them because we are part of Confederation. And one of the things that they repeatedly suggest, and it is still a fringe movement, is separation from Canada if British Columbia is unwilling to behave as they see fit. So that's one of the issues we're dealing with. We're also dealing with the United States. So somebody who's taught Canadian history for many years, we are in bed with an elephant. And although Biden seems to have some policies for climate change, Trump didn't believe it existed. And again, I see in the comments, it's not a question of belief or not, which is true. There is the science. But for 4 years, we had a president of the United States who was very much not concerned about actually changing anything. And that's one of the big issues when it comes to climate change is that, one, we're kind of past the point of no return. So as somebody who's talked on this topic for a number of years, to actually prevent climate change in a big way, we had to do stuff years ago. At this point, we're not actually stopping climate change, we're just mitigating it. And it really is up to us how bad we want to actually see that change occur and what we're willing to actually adapt. So last year is a good example, the wildfires in this province, the heat wave, the flooding, all of these things are connected, and they're all connected to this aspect of climate change. And it's not just Canada. So you have similar wildfires in the United States and Australia, Europe. The environment itself is changing. So, with regards to what kind of paradigm shift, it is simply shifting that entire paradigm. We built entire cities, entire communities on the automobile, on fossil fuels, on everyone having their own house with, thousands of square feet of room in their property, and single families. And, I'm guilty of it as well. So I have an automobile. I have a house that is much too large for my needs. And I'm also very much aware of this because, my father lived in Engineeka, lived in northern BC, and grew up in a one-room cabin. He was a trapper his entire life. His father before him was a trapper his entire life. So I think of the house I have now, it's a mansion compared to what he had when he was growing up. But this is part of the modern life that many people seem to embrace, many people seem to celebrate, and that isn't necessarily sustainable when it comes to actually living the life that we want to live. Kind of continuing on what kind of stakeholders, right holders we can look at with regards to climate justice. I'm not necessarily going to talk about all of them, but I will talk about one aspect that is increasingly becoming relevant, and that is simply the existence of First Nations in Canada. They've always existed, but also a number of court cases that have come through in recent years that seem to make First Nations people more of a stakeholder, at least on a national level. So looking at court cases like land title claims, Stracotin case, the most recent Knutson case, which we're not sure what the ruling will be on that, but even cases like the Blueberry case in 2021, which established that the Crown does have to consult and negotiate with nations that signed historic treaties. And then previous cases like Haida and Taku River, which established, again, this duty to consult. So I think one of the big changes is going to happen in Canada is simply working with Indigenous peoples more and more. And this isn't just unique to Canada. So Indigenous peoples exist around the world. And with things like UNDRIP, there is this push to recognize Indigenous peoples, to listen to them and to respond to their needs. Partly with connecting to the environment, this gets into the fact that often it's Indigenous peoples who bear the brunt of this devastation. So we talk about environmental racism, for example. There's a reason why a lot of hydro dams are built in the north and are built in areas that affect Indigenous peoples. And Matthew Evenden has a wonderful book that looks at why the Fraser has not been dammed to any large extent. And it largely has to do with salmon, but it also has to do with who's living on the Fraser, who benefits from the power, and who feels the impact when reservoirs are constructed. So there are those larger issues that are at play. And with regards to Indigenous peoples, and one of the prompts that I got was just kind of, why would Indigenous peoples become leaders in the movement? It is simply that they've been impacted. So right now we have the protests to the west of us with this Wet'suwet'en and Unistoten, but we also have historic examples, Grassy Narrows, the tar sands in northern Alberta, so all the Treaty 8 nations there, the El Dorado mine, the Northwest Territories, again, numerous hydroelectric projects across the country, indeed across the world, that have flooded people out. And even things that aren't necessarily so obvious. So Shoal Lake, for many years, did not have clean drinking water. And that was partly because Winnipeg built an aqueduct from Shoal Lake to Winnipeg so that Winnipeg could have clean drinking water. So an interesting example there. And years ago, I had a student who actually made a map of where all the boil water advisories were in the country. So he actually took a Canadian map, he drew the treaty lines on it, and he put push pins where there were boil water advisories. And maybe people talk about this as an infrastructure issue, and it is. But what was really revealing is a lot of these boil water advisories are not in the north, they're not in remote areas, they're actually in heavily developed areas, just that the infrastructure ends at the reserve, or the water purification plant only benefits the local non-Indigenous community. It provides no benefit to the Indigenous community whatsoever. So how have Indigenous peoples become leaders in that? Simply by being affected by it. I think kind of getting into what Aven was talking about, one of the things that needs to occur, I would say, is simply listening to Indigenous peoples with regards to what is actually occurring. There's this interesting sense about Canada and about the world, which is kind of baffling when you really think about it. We don't have another planet. I mean, in theory, we could get to another planet. So that is theoretical. Not all of us will actually get to another planet. You know, it would be a struggle even to get the people who would actually make it to the other planet to actually do it. But we are happy with destroying this world, but also concerned about losing the benefits we might have. So it's this paradox of just destroying the environment. And it's an issue that's existed for, hundreds of years. So people have looked at the Columbian Exchange, looked at the quote unquote discovery of the New World, and pointed out that one of the things that benefited Europe was that Europe was destroying itself environmentally in 1492. And in 1492, suddenly found a whole new world to extract resources from, take wealth from, so that their standard of living did not actually have to change. So again, it's just a similar process. It's just now we've affected the entire planet, and we've become comfortable with it, I would say. That's probably the biggest issue. So we have species going extinct, species that are endangered, and there's not a lot of concern in people's day-to-day life as long as we can, have fun, go to work, enjoy some of the creature features that exist. We seem to be happy with that. There's also this sense of kind of what's important. So what do I mean by that? There's numerous natural habitats around the world that are devastated, that are important to Indigenous peoples, important to local peoples. There doesn't seem to be a lot of concern about it. So Site C Dam, good example. When I was living in Alberta, nobody cared. It wasn't in Alberta. It wasn't an issue that affected them. But I was also struck when Notre Dame burned. Suddenly, people who had no connection to France were devastated that this roof had caught on fire and the cathedral had been damaged. So that was their concern, was a cathedral in France, in Paris. But Site C, no concern whatsoever. It wasn't even a major concern, even in the province here in British Columbia. So there's a lot of people who just aren't that concerned about it. When I talk about talking to Indigenous people, I think one of the important things too is to recognize that it's not just a binary of Indigenous peoples are environmentalists and non-Indigenous people are non-environmentalists. So it is actually talking to Indigenous peoples, recognizing that there is diversity, that there is over 600 distinct First Nations in this country. with different needs, different desires, and different relationships to the environment itself. So I always tell my students, as soon as you start saying all Indigenous people view this or see this or have this point of view, you're wrong, because there is so much diversity in this country. And I think with regards to listening and what to do with the knowledge itself, I think Michael really kind of caught on it. You actually have to do something. So I don't know more, isn't necessarily in everyone's vocabulary anymore. It should be. And the whole message behind that movement, the organizers themselves, was actually taking what they were learning in university and actually doing something about it. So, having a teach-in like this is great, but at the end of the day, it is really about doing things, actually doing something, not just sitting there and worrying about it or writing papers about it or giving talks about it. It's about actually getting involved and actually pushing for some positive change. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sims. That's really informative. Yeah, I really appreciate what you were saying about why Indigenous become leaders, because they are directly impacted. And I think it's easy for people to sit back and be apathetic when they're not directly impacted by these issues. And it's unfortunate that a lot of our actions in the developed nations are impacting the less developed nations more so. And so they're forced to see these impacts. And yeah, it's really important that we do take more action. I was thinking the same thing. We do a lot of talking and writing about this, but it's really important to get out there and have some tangible actions, as Dr. Murphy was saying. And Dr. Safaei, you ready?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristy, and your colleagues for organizing this wonderful panel. I am already enjoying the insightful presentations by Michael and Daniel. I'm sorry if I sound or look tired, because I just came out of a 3-hour Zoom meeting this morning. I'm not working specifically on climate issues or particular solutions, but I'm interested and care about justice, health, and politics. And of course, they're all intertwined, and this is a very huge topic to tackle and deal with. What I hope to contribute is some very sort of panoramic macro observations and issues that I hope will frame our mind around devising and thinking about solutions or approaches to deal with climate change and justice. Let me begin by reading to you. This is my own translation of a version of a psalm which is attributed to King David thousands of years ago, and that I think very concisely summarizes what we're dealing with here. And so here's the psalm: that the world is prosperous with its people, and people thrive on agriculture, which is, of course, the natural economy of the day. Agriculture thrives on security, and security arises from justice. So I've been very impressed by this psalm for many years, and it has inspired me, it has informed my view of things. And therefore, I thought that is something interesting to share. As we all know, any calamity and disaster will hit the weaker hardest, and climate change is no exception. So whether it's wars, natural disasters, COVID-19, or climate change, it is the communities of color, or the BIPOC, which is the buzzword nowadays, are generally the weaker, and therefore they are sort of experiencing the brunt of such disasters. Yeah. And there are two reasons for that I may summarize. One is that they are more exposed to such disasters, including climate change, environmental degradation. And the second, they are least prepared to deal with it or cope with the consequences of such disasters, be they heat waves, droughts, wildfires, heavy downpours, winter storms, floods, hurricanes, and etc. Now, of course, when we think about mitigation policies, and Michael alluded to those, unfortunately, there is not much broad political support for many of the mitigation policies because, fortunately, people are interested in their own interests, and when they see that some policies are perhaps infringing on their interests, they react. And again, this is an unfortunate reality that most of the policies are being designed and formulated by the powerful and to serve the interests of those who are in power. And so no wonder there isn't much really genuine, concrete policy action that is persistent towards addressing the climate change. Daniel referred to our only planet, and I think that climate change is a planetary tragedy of commons. The term tragedy of commons is quite well known in economics and maybe in other disciplines. And it goes back to centuries ago in Europe when people were, let's say, grazing their cattle on common properties. And of course, everybody had the motivation to overgraze, and as a result, we ended up with destroying the pastures. So, but this is where it comes from. But any sort of utilization, overutilization of a common resource without any collective concern for its sustainability will lead to such tragedy. And climate change is, like I said, a tragedy of commons on a global scale. Now, of course, we are thinking about policies and politics domestically and internationally and because this is a problem on a global scale, we need to have a global governance that is really careful and cares about such global problems. And I don't want to be negative, but the reality is that unfortunately we do not have a solid, caring, environmentally friendly global governance in place. We have some institutions that, as we have experienced quite recently and in many more instances in the past, is that it was formed after the Second World War II with some countries with veto powers, and anything that is going against their interests is shot down and vetoed. So there is no really a collective and serious interest on a global level for addressing these issues. Of course, we can do our own, we can do things, as Michael pointed out, individually, locally, within our nation. But because the scale of the problem is global, we can only do so much. And if they are others are taking advantage of this in the sense that they are over polluting, for example, while we are reducing our emissions, then that's not going to be sustainable. So we do need local, municipal, national, and international cooperation, serious cooperation to deal with these issues. But I'm afraid to say that I don't see that on the near horizon. Hopefully it will happen with active participation of people who really care about the environment, whether it's through individual actions or collective actions and changing the the attitudes of politics and politicians that are involved in these decision makings. And as I mentioned, the impacts of climate change and environmental disasters are very unequal, unjust. Rural and remote areas are much harder hit by people living in central urban areas. Globally is the same. The people of the north are less exposed to these consequences than people in the south. And again, the more advanced developed countries are better equipped to address these issues, although they are actually the creator of the disaster, whereas the developing countries who have not been contributing to such changes are again experiencing the brunt of such disasters or adversities. So injustice in any sense of the term, in my view, is due to some imbalance. So inequalities in socioeconomic distribution of resources and production obviously has led to significant poverty and inequality in many countries, including Canada. We are a rich country, but we have 20% rate of poverty for children. And so is the climate change is the result of imbalances in natural forces. There's an imbalance between the absorptive capacity of our planet and its tolerance. And of course, we have, on the other hand, a significant increase in the rate of emission. So this is out of balance, and we have to bring these things into balance. And any activities or any policies that will help us to bring balance, both into our socioeconomic systems as well as physical and environmental systems, are critically needed. I would also point out that climate injustice or environmental injustice is actually the conflation of two injustices. One is the injustice in the reaping the benefits of activities that cause climate change. And the other one is the injustice in shouldering the burden of the climate change that those activities will cause. So this is to say that those who benefit most from the goodies of the environment are least exposed to the destruction and the negative consequences of climate and environmental change. And this is totally unjust. I understand that my thoughts are scattered, but I thought perhaps at the end of it, I can put them together in a coherent way, in the sense that we need to be aware of the root causes of such adverse, unfortunate outcomes. And a better understanding of those root causes and the trends would help us think more realistically about the solutions. And like I mentioned, if we are going to sustain as a society, if we are going to flourish, we have to address the issues of inequality, both in terms of socioeconomic positions, as well as the environmental sustainability. And let me just summarize this by asserting that injustice is the hallmark of a class-based society. And as long as our societies are classified or stratified about among those who have and those who don't, then we are going to be dealing with all kinds of adversities that come our way. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, it would be affecting the lives and the livelihoods of those who are vulnerable and less privileged. So this is a very unfortunate sort of state of affairs that I'm afraid to bring to this panel. But I thought it would just provide some realistic context around our hopeful solutions that we are thinking about implementing both locally, nationally, and internationally. And I stop there. Happy to respond to any comments or questions, if any.
Thank you, Dr. Safaei. Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, and it really ties into what Dr. Sims was saying when you're talking about those who benefit most are the least exposed to the impact, and tying that into environmental racism. And yeah, I agree, we really need to address this issue and find policies to help bring these inequities into balance moving forward for a sustainable future. And I'll open the floor to questions. Does anybody in the audience want to speak? Or post in the chat? Anyone at all? Okay, well, I have a question then. I'm just wondering, so let's say we form this world government between the four of you. What would be your first policy that you would implement to help move us forward?
Well, that's a dangerous question, especially considering that many of the people who are against climate change or against the mask mandate think that academics want to create one world government. Kind of feeding into that. I'm not going to say a policy, but I think one of the things that needs to change is accepting that life can be good with less. I think it's probably the best way of approaching that. So we've kind of built the society where, you know, there's this expectation of continual growth, wealth, prosperity. Everyone can, you know, live the American dream, if you want to call it that. And I think one of the things is accepting that life can be good with less. So we don't necessarily need to have more than our neighbors. We don't necessarily need to have every creature feature, you know, that's available out there. That there's some ways of actually living a life where you're not just always chasing the dollar or always concerned about things like that. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Living within our means, that's definitely one way to address the inequalities we were speaking of. We don't need to be excessive in our consumption. I just saw Dr. Miletus posted a question. Would anyone like to speak to gender in the climate crisis? Oh, sorry. Dr. Murphy, did you have something to add?
I didn't have anything to add on that, but I was going to respond to your question, but I'm happy to defer if someone wants to address the gender question. It's not something I've done a great deal of thinking about. It's something that I will build into my course, but my course is at such an early stage of development that I haven't done enough serious thinking on this issue to make say something that would be useful. I think it's probably the most honest answer I can give.
And I only add that, I mean, of course, by no means I am an expert on gender studies, but I could just think of, as I mentioned, the most vulnerable people are subject to greater harm because of the climate change. And I would include women and other non-binary genders into that group, because again, they are more exposed to the adversities and they are less prepared to deal with the outcomes.
could just state from like, there's a lot of arguments regarding gender and the environment. And I think one of the more convincing ones, perhaps though not necessarily perfect, is this idea that a lot of our current capitalist system is predicated on the patriarchy and this idea of being better than your fellow man. And that, again, getting to what Jalil has pointed out, quite rightly so, that women are generally more disadvantaged than men in most categories. And so that means that a lot of these impacts fall disproportionately on women. But it's still very much men who are in charge. And again, not necessarily saying that's a good thing or that's the way it should be, but we look at our elected officials here in Canada, we don't have equity of the genders or even equality of the genders. It's still very much male dominated. And so there's those differences that exist there. I also say some Indigenous communities have talked about how women are the stewards of the land and should take care of the land or own the land. But that varies from community to community, but it is something that people have pointed out. I have a friend, Pauline Johnson, who's in the University of Alberta, who talks about how the treaties on the prairies should have never happened because it was the women who owned the land, but it was only the men who signed the treaties. And so again, there's those larger arguments as well.
Yeah, I don't have really anything to add on that either. Unfortunately, hasn't been a huge area of exploration for me outside of just the general equity pieces that come into play.
Go ahead, Dr. Murphy.
Yeah, I'll just engage with your question, Kristy, and also, along with Daniel, caution you in handing over so much power to the members of the panel. You might not be able to trust us with it.
It's only hypothetical.
Yeah. I'd like to partly agree and also disagree with something Jalil said, and this is the idea of global government. On the one hand, I agree with Jalil that, if we're going to get effective action on climate change, we need to deal with the reality of human imperfection, and that includes dealing with the reality of human self-interest, human selfishness, right? Now, again, not all human beings are selfish or purely self-interested. Many are, right? And we need to deal with that reality, right? If you're going to get effective climate change action policies, you need to work with that self-interest, right? So one small example of that off the top of my head would be, pitching a carbon tax that gives money back to taxpayers, right? So if you pitch a carbon tax where people are simply being asked to pay higher prices for things, that's less likely to fly, I think, than a policy which hands them checks at the end of the month. Right. And I think that's, again, a policy that's working with people's self-interest, people's selfishness, people's unwillingness to make large sacrifices. Right. So again, I don't think we should be hoping that people are going to be more perfect than they are. We need to, in a sense, try to motivate them to be better, but we also need to, if we want action now, we need to meet people where they are, in a way, motivate them where they are. Right. I think if we move to a system of global governance, I don't think that's going to eliminate the problem of competing interests, of competing selfish interests, right? I think it'll just replicate it at a different level. So in a sense, I don't necessarily see a move to global governance as an automatic solution to climate change action. I first of all agree that it's not likely in the medium, even longer term. I really just don't see us getting there. But I'm not convinced that it would be a solution to these other issues anyhow, right? Unless we're also moving beyond capitalism, which again, I think is probably a non-starter, right? I mean, I think in many ways, yes, you can trace the problem of climate change to problems with capitalism, but to simply expect that the world is going to move beyond capitalism in the near to medium future is wishful thinking, right? So I think, again, I'd also like to say one other thing, which is that I avoided teaching climate politics for many years, partly because I thought it was too hopeless of a subject to deal with, right? Because of these collective action problems, the prisoner's dilemma. I prefer to take the approach now, and this is the approach I'll be pitching in my course, is that, you know, we need to believe like idealists, right? That we're going to tackle this problem, but we need to act like realists in the near to medium term. And I'll stop there.
If I may respond to Michael, thanks for your comment. Maybe I wasn't quite clear. I did not suggest that global governance is a solution to climate change. I just mentioned that the current global governance is dysfunctional and incapable of addressing the problem, which is of a global scale. And I appreciate that, yes, all the problems and issues that we have is because of the capitalist system that we have, but I'm not naive to suggest that, well, there is a handy alternative right there to replace it. So, but whatever we can do in order to mitigate and water down the rough edges of the system and move it toward a more inclusive, democratic, and humane society. That is what the hope is, and that is what we have to push for.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and on the note of human self-interest, of course, we do respond well to rewards. People always want to be motivated, so that might be a good solution. I would think, though, people being in the interest of self-interest, that they would be looking at self-preservation and having broader thoughts on this issue. And I would like to think that a world government could address some of these issues, but I am inclined to think that there might be too many actors and influences and too much power involved, but many good things to think about. I see a question in the chat. Does our response to the global pandemic make you more optimistic or more pessimistic about our ability to tackle the climate crisis? Oh, sorry, Dr. Murphy, I keep missing your hand. Which were you looking to address?
You go ahead, take Daniel. Daniel, I think, wants to respond to that one. I was actually going to ask Daniel a question, but I can hold off until we deal with this.
Okay, go ahead, Daniel.
Makes me more pessimistic, to be honest. One of the things, and I actually wrote an article looking at the environmental movement last year, where I was talking about the pandemic. And, you know, we look at these civilizations and cultures in the past that disappeared or were dramatically changed. And I mean, I don't want to say disappeared. People do use the term disappeared. So like the Maya never disappeared. The Pueblo never disappeared. We call them the Anasazi in the past, although the Pueblo are still very upset about that because the term means ancient enemy. It's an innate term. But even looking like the Indus Valley, there's been numerous cultures that have disappeared from what we kind of expect them to be. The reality is they've changed, and they've had to change because the climate changed. And I think we often look, even when we look at things like the fall of the Roman Empire, we often look and we're like, well, how could they be so stupid to have this and then have it just utterly collapse in front of them? And I think the pandemic, in my point of view, I often wonder if we're in the middle of one of these collapses, because it does seem like there is increasingly this push towards ignorance, this rejection of experts, this rejection of science. And, you know, just kind of watching as we all careen off the cliff. And 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, will people be talking about these ancient civilizations that existed? And instead of Roman emperors, it'll be American presidents, and people will talk about Trump like they talked about, say, Caligula or somebody like that. So yeah, I think it has left me pessimistic, and I do think this is the issue. We don't have a system to replace capitalism with that anyone's willing to actually use, and I'm not saying they should. So there's been attempts to try and fix capitalism, whether it's corporatism or communism or socialism. None of them seem to really work. People don't like them. But it does seem like we're in this system and we're, kind of on this track and we're heading towards a cliff. And we might just not have an option of actually escaping that. But the one thing I would say is, these groups, Indus Valley, the Maya, the Pueblo, they didn't disappear like people talk about. They just changed, they transformed, and life continued, and what existed in the past is in the past. So I think the world will change whether we want it to or not, and at a certain point it'll just be something that we have to live with.
Yes, I definitely agree with what you were saying there. It certainly made me more pessimistic as well. Go ahead, Dr. Murphy.
I was actually going to ask Daniel a question, and I was struck by something you said in your presentation, Daniel, about Indigenous diversity, including on issues of environmentalism. I'm really glad you raised that point. One of the things that I've, have been reading about recently, as I've been doing research on my perspective course, is that you're right. When it comes to, for example, Indigenous attitudes towards oil and gas development, there's this natural assumption that there's going to be all opposed, but the reality is that there's a big mix, right? There's many opposed, but many communities already involved in oil and gas development, and others wanting to get involved. So if you want to really respect the principle of self-determination, you have to respect that those communities are making their own choices regarding their economic development trajectory. But I wanted to ask you, if someone was to engage with communities that are embarking on oil and gas development and engage them in a conversation, an act of persuasion that would try to get them to change track because of environmental concerns, how would you do that? What would you appeal to? Again, I know that's a hard question, but I'd certainly be interested to see what you have to say on that.
I think one of the things for those nations that are interested in oil and gas or in other economic developments that other nations are opposed to, I think there's still generally this, at least lip service, if not commitment, and I would say commitment to sustainability. So it's not necessarily we need to stop oil production now. It is how do we use this resource in a way that is beneficial, and it gets into these larger stereotypes about Indigenous people. This idea that we were just kind of running around the forest in the nude, living off of plants that willingly sacrificed themselves to us. There was mining that occurred. It was generally surface mining, and there was forestry that occurred. There was developments that occurred, and there were changes to the environment itself. And the evidence is still there. When I was teaching environmental history, the first class that I ever taught as a tenure track professor with my chair for my department, so we co-taught the class. The first class, we were talking about irrigation systems in the Phoenix area. And the first comment we got from a student was, I don't think Indigenous people had any impact on the environment. Where's the evidence? Where's the proof? And then my chair and my friend, Jeremy Mowat, pulled out the map of the irrigation channels that existed in the Phoenix area and said, here's the proof. And there's proof like that from the archaeological record, really all around what we call Turtle Island, if you want to use that term. So I think just kind of getting to that approach. But yeah, I think it is really this recognition that is this attempt for sustainability. I think that's one of the big challenges, is that we're trying to reach that balance where we don't necessarily have to change everything, but we can prevent what is going to occur with regards to climate change. The big issue is that we don't seem to be changing fast enough. So, it used to be, can we prevent 1 degree of warming overall? Now it's, can we prevent 2 degrees and keep it at 1.5? But it is this matter of how do we actually fix things? And it is complicated. I recycle, I imagine many of you do. It's a good thing, but it's not going to save the environment. And you have to also think about, the reality of what the war in Ukraine is doing to the environment right now. So all the things that we're doing to try and fix the environment here, all the burning debris, the rubbish, the waste from this military conflict, that's not doing anything good for the environment. And then not to mention, a few weeks ago, the concern over Chernobyl, the other reactors in Ukraine, and whether or not Russia was damaging them, setting them on fire, or potentially was going to use them in the war itself. And then also the concern we have about whether or not Russia will fire atomic weapons or biological weapons, chemical weapons. This is the awkward situation. I don't think we're gonna have a one world government. But when we're trying to fix things here at UNBC by removing paper forms, that's good. But we're still in this world where we're watching another country attack another country. And we're really hoping they're not gonna cross a certain threshold. But even when they're not crossing that threshold, they're still producing a lot of pollution, a lot of waste.
Yeah.
I just want to make another observation. And speaking of the diversity of views of different First Nations, there's also a diversity of views in the capitalist world. So what has been happening more recently is of course, the neoliberal approach in capitalism, which is basically taking control of all the resources worldwide and using to the best interest of a few. It hasn't been like that in the past. So there has been a trend toward more selfish and polar utilization of resources. But we have to recognize also the experience of other democratic capitalist countries, and in particular, the experience of the so-called social democracies in Northern Europe, or the so-called Scandinavian countries. There are good practices and good examples that we can borrow from them in terms of their approach toward environmental sustainability and social responsibility, and providing social protections for the vulnerable people who, for one reason or another, are subject to the vagaries of the market or the disasters that happen in the environment. There was a reference in one of the comments in the text that maybe it was because I used perhaps the term natural disasters. I didn't mean to say that these disasters happen naturally, but I meant to say that they happen in the nature. But I am fully aware of the fact that it is human misbehavior and disregard for the environment that has led to such disastrous climate change. And I mentioned that as a result of when I referred to the term, the tragedy of commons, I was explicitly referring to that careless, selfish use of a common property without any regard for what it means for others and how sustainable that could be. I mean, we have had this, the cod fishery in the East. That's another example of when you overfish, then you end up with a disaster in that resource. And there are many examples of that around the world. So I just wanted to point out that There's no single capitalist system. There's a variety of systems within the capitalist system, and some of them are more human than others. Unfortunately, we happen to live north of one of the worst.
We've also built this world in a way, kind of getting into the idea of neoliberalism. We look at the bus system here in Prince George. People don't like it because it's slow, it's inefficient, it takes forever. If you miss the bus, you have to wait half an hour. But there's kind of this idea that we're going to improve it, and that it started out as nothing. But my grandmother, who grew up in Ferndale, which is east of here, she can still remember the bus schedule from Ferndale to Prince George, as well as how much it cost for her to get on the bus, go to the movie theater, and buy some popcorn. And so the busing system used to be far more extensive in the past. But we, at a certain point, decided that the automobile was the most important, particularly the personal automobile. So the bus system was phased out, and now we're bringing it back. But there's still this emphasis on, we need to have a personal automobile. And, I'm kind of unique. I mean, I have an automobile, so I'm guilty of it, but I'm also kind of unique in my neighborhood for having one. So most of my neighbors have 2, 3, 4. And, it's just one of those interesting aspects. And, talking and seeing colleagues, here in Alberta, the 2-family automobile is kind of the standard. So yeah, there's just those kind of changes that occur as well.
It's definitely industry driven. Dr. Murphy, did you have something to say?
I wanted to ask Aven, who's clearly a member of a younger generation on this panel, whether you felt more or less optimistic on this question of climate change mitigation, and whether or not your own research leads you to be more or less optimistic on that score.
I feel like I kind of go both ways. I feel like my whole life I've been hearing about we need to be doing all these things about climate change, and it doesn't really feel like we've made a lot of the changes that we need to be making in order to avoid disasters in the future. And growing up in the north, I've seen climate changing throughout my lifetime, so it's quite obvious on the landscape in a lot of places. So I feel like sometimes I'm rather pessimistic about it, but I also know a lot of people who are really working on these issues, and who I feel like that kind of, I don't know, maybe more recent view of climate justice is growing, that really incorporates different priorities and trying to bring different voices into the conversation. So I find that stuff really helpful. And there's a lot of focus on youth and stuff in the Yukon as well. So that's growing. And I think that stuff's really neat. And that makes me hopeful, because I think that probably some of the most hopeful I've ever felt working on climate justice issues has been when we've collaborated with different youth groups and stuff like that. And it's really, really great to see how driven people still are, even though, you grow up your whole life hearing about all the things that could go wrong in your lifetime.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks, Aven. I echo those sentiments as well. And just a reminder, we do have the Youth and Climate Justice panel coming up at 2 as well. I just want to thank you all again for coming. This was a really great discussion. I really appreciate you participating in these panels. I know Gary has a few words to say, and we're just about at time here, so I'll pass back to Gary. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kristy, for hosting this excellent panel, and to the panelists for offering a range of perspectives and advice on this very wicked problem, as they call these types of problems, and to all of you for attending. Thank you on behalf of Global Fridays. We do have one more Global Friday left in the semester. That will be next week on April 1st. And it's Anna Feuerstein, who's a professor in the Department of English at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And her talk will be on the appetites of the planter class, the racial politics of eating animals in British colonial narratives. So we look forward to that talk. Please join us if you have the time. And yeah, thanks everybody, and good luck with the other events that you're holding as part of the teach-in, Kristy. I understand it's been very successful so far, and I wish you continued success.
Thank you so much, Gary. Yes, it's been wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks again, Kristy.
Take
Thank you.
care.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye, everyone.